everybody, and welcome back to the Popular Music Books in Process series, which is a joint project of the POP Conference, IASPM US, and the Journal of Popular Music Studies. I am Francesca Royster, and I'm here to welcome you on the behalf of our other organizers as well, Carl Wilson, Eric Weisbard, Gus Stadler, and Kimberly Mack. You can find out more about the series and get our whole calendar on the IASPM website under the Journal of Popular Music Studies tab, and I hope you do. And you can also get on the mailing list by contacting Eric. And you can also there catch up on all the videos of all of our past sessions. And next week's session is, well, not next week, I'm sorry, October 25th session. We're going to be so excited to have Ricky Rodriguez talking about his new book, Kiss Across the Ocean, together with Alexandra Vasquez. And that's going to be October 25th at 5 o'clock Eastern Time. But today, we're so excited to have authors from the 33 and a Third Japan series, focusing on city pop, punk rock, and female artists in Japan. So, this conversation will be focused on ways that women in Japan have shaped popular music history and challenged gender norms. And in particular, the panel is going to discuss ways that music by female artists reflect broader trends in contemporary Japanese history and culture. The panel is going to discuss the importance of researching and writing about these artists whose contributions to the music have frequently been dismissed by scholars. Lasse Lehtonen will share insights from his new book, Yuming's The 14th Moon, and Brooke McCorkle Okazaki will discuss similar issues of gender and music that arose in her book on the pop punk trio Shonen Knife, titled Shonen Knife's Happy Hour, Food, Gender, Rock, and Roll, which was from Bloomsbury from 2021. And Lasse's book is from 2022. Before the panel gets started, Noriko Manabe is the series editor for 33 and a Third Japan, and she's going to start off the conversation by briefly introducing the series. I'm just going to tell you some quick facts about our participants. We're really excited. Lasse Lehtonen is a postdoctoral researcher and part-time lecturer at the University of Helsinki, Finland, where he received his PhD in 2018. And his research focuses on music in modern Japan, ranging from Western art music composition to popular music and video game music. Brooke McCorkle Okazaki is an assistant professor of music at Carleton College in Northfield, Minnesota. She specializes in opera of the 19th and 20th century, film music, and the music of modern Japan. And in addition to several articles, McCorkle Okazaki is the co-author of Japan's Green Monsters, Environmental Commentary, and Kaju Cinema. Sorry, bad pronunciation. Noriko Manabe is Associate Professor of Music Studies at Temple University, conducting research on music and social movements and on popular music. Her monograph, "The Revolution Will Not Be Televised: Protest Music After Fukushima," won prizes from the Association for Asian Studies, the British Forum for Ethnomusicology, and others. And she is, of course, the editor of the 33 and a Third Japan book series. So I'm going to turn things over to our presenters. Oh, before we start though, I just want to remind everyone that if you have questions or comments, please put them in the chat, and Gus is going to conduct the Q&A at the end of the session. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Francesca, and thank you to Lasse and Brooke for coming together for this panel. I think it's really great. So as Francesca mentioned, I'm the series editor for 33 and a Third Japan. And if I may just share my screen for a bit, I'll show you what 33 and a Third Japan is about. So this is actually an offshoot of the regular 33 and a Third book series that I'm sure all of you are familiar with, at Bloomsbury, and it's part of 33 1/3 Global, which at this point has 33 1/3 Brazil, 33 1/3 Europe, 33 1/3 Oceania, and 33 1/3 South Asia, which is soon forthcoming. And so here's the website for the 33 1/3 Japan series on Bloomsbury, which I'll just quickly put into the chat here. And just so you know, we have 9 books that have been published thus far. And just to highlight a couple of them besides Lasse's and Brooke's today, they do cover a whole slew of topics. For example, Henry Johnson's Nene's Koza Dabasa is about Okinawa and how Okinawa embodies all the aspects of colonialism, war, and feminine construction that you could imagine might be associated with a place like Okinawa. We have a couple of books that are about anime. So, for example, Kunio book on Totoro is talking about Totoro as a way of talking about nostalgia in Japan, because of course the setting is in 1950s Japan. He also says a lot of very interesting things about the production process and the creative process of putting together an anime from the music point of view. Also in anime, we have the Cowboy Bebop book by Rose Bridges. And in this book, Rose takes the approach of looking at musical characterization, which one normally associates with Verdi or Wagner or something like that, but she does it quite effectively for Cowboy Bebop, looking at how people like Spike and Jet and other favorite characters of Cowboy Bebop are musically different from one another. And for this book, I actually had the pleasure of interviewing Watanabe, the producer, as well as corresponding with Yoko Kanno, which was quite a blast. And so some features from those interviews are included in that book, some of which will blow your mind. And then in other books, we have the AKB48 book. AKB48 is an idol pop group in Japan that literally has 100 women, not 48, 100. And Patrick Galbraith and Jason Carlin are writing about this group with a subtitle of The Economy of Affect. And I and Michael Bordash and a couple of other board members have actually found it an effective way to teach the Frankfurt School to undergraduates in a very entertaining manner. So I highly recommend that book to you if you haven't heard of AKB48. And then finally, to highlight the first book in the series, which is the book on Hatsune Miku, the Vocaloid by Keisuke Yamada, who takes a fan studies approach to looking at the subject. So that's what we have. And so if you are interested in contributing a book to 33 1/3 Japan, we do have our own review process. So I would encourage anybody who is interested to get in touch with me and start a conversation, and hopefully we can help you get your proposal through. And that is it. So I'll hand it over to Lasse and Brooke.
Well, thank you so much, Francesca and Noriko and everyone for inviting us to have a chat today.
Yeah, it's really, really great to be with all of you here today. So thank you for inviting us.
Well, let's get started. Lasse, how did you become interested in writing about Yumin? Because I don't think many people in Europe or the United States have heard of Yumin, but perhaps nowadays that's changed a little bit.
Yeah, I guess that it probably has changed. And actually, I would like to say in the beginning that probably, although I'm not sure if everyone here is familiar with Yumin's name or the name of Yumi Arai or Yumi Matsutoya after her marriage, actually, I would claim that probably most of you have heard her songs, which is because those have been used in the animations by Hayao Miyazaki, whom actually Noriko just mentioned in the case of Totoro. Yumin's songs are not used in Totoro, but in Kiki's Delivery Service and in The Wind Rises. So if you have seen those films, you actually have heard Yumin's songs. But as for your actual question of how I got interested in writing about Yumin, well, I've actually been very interested. I mean, I personally like the music of the 1970s, including Yumin. So actually, I have to confess that quite often my research topics are kind of guided by my musical preferences.
Yeah.
But obviously, this does not necessarily make good research. So I got interested in kind of studying the lyrics and the differences between the work of singer-songwriters like Yumin, who actually write songs for themselves, as compared with, talking about the content of the 1970s, as compared with female singers who mainly perform songs by, well, mostly male singers, writers. And the viewpoints are quite different here. So that's how I got interested in studying Yumin from the viewpoint of gender, which is something that we'll probably be returning to in our discussion.
Yeah,
But well,
totally.
I guess that you could say probably the same about Shonen Knife. I mean, some people probably know Shonen Knife, but it's not a major thing in Europe or the US, I would guess. How did you become interested in studying Shonen Knife?
Well, it's like I think people like maybe Studio Ghibli using Yumin's music and bringing it to a more international audience. With me and Shonen Knife, I read a little bit about in my introduction. They had a song featured on the Powerpuff Girls.
Yeah.
So when I was growing up, I enjoyed that cartoon, and I just remember being so taken with the music video because I'm a bass player as well. And I had never seen an all-female trio on television before playing like rock and roll music. And like yourself, I've been a fan for a long time before I got a chance to write this book. It's a very kind invitation. Thinking about what it means to be a woman musician in Japan in the early 1980s, writing your own music, playing your own instruments, and doing that kind of activity. I think it's really interesting that I'd be more intellectually and academically aware of Japanese modern history and culture and ideas of gender and music. And it's kind of nice, contrasting with, say, when Noriko was pointing out AKB48, that's really, the pop idol incarnate right now of everything crafted by a primarily male executive position, written primarily by male composers and lyricists for the performance by these hundreds of women at this point.
Yeah, I think that it's also interesting. I mean, also based on the introduction that Noriko kindly gave us today. I mean, many books in the 33 and the third Japan series kind of relate to each other, which of course, I mean, AKB48 obviously relates to our books. But one thing that I was very surprised to notice is that actually there is a lot of common between our books.
Yes.
I mean, related to gender and obviously this, well, female agency and other topics like this, although I must say that we are talking about quite different types of music here.
Yeah, I thought that was so interesting when I read your book, Yumin's 14th Moon, because even though she was operating about a decade prior to Shonen Knife, and she's quite well known in Japan versus Shonen Knife, which is much more on the indie circuit. There's so many connections. And I think one of the biggest connections for me was looking at Yumin as one of the first major female artists, like you said, that was writing and creating, recording her own musical material.
Yeah, that's definitely true. And how do you actually see it now that you have read my books? Well, do you think that there is a kind of trajectory from Yumin going on to these female bands who made their music in the
Oh,
1980s? Or are they completely separate phenomena? What would you say?
well, I think there are connections, and I talk a little bit about the history of women's rock in Japan in my book as sort of a precursor to Shonen Knife's foundation. So I think Yumin is definitely a key figure along with previous artists like Misora Hibari in just drawing attention to the kinds of music and kinds of musical positions women could occupy and be successful at occupying. In Yumin's case, what I think is really interesting is that she struck this right balance between like popular success and artistic integrity. But I also think it's interesting that she's also working within what was a kind of global phenomenon in some respects of the women singer-songwriter, like you mentioned Joni Mitchell and Carole King. And even though Yumi's operating primarily in a Japanese sphere, it's part of a bigger system of women artists in that generation. And that same system continues, I think, in the 1980s with women and punk bands like Joan Jett and the Runaways and the Go-Go's and Bangles and all that sort of happening around the same time as Shonen Knife in Japan.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, I also agree that there are these parallel developments in the US and in Europe concerning female singer-songwriters. But then again, I guess that you could say that also probably for the bands you're discussing. And one topic that I find to be very, very fascinating about your book is the broad overview you give to the history of female bands in Japan. And I also liked your conceptualization of calling them josei rock or female rock, which is obviously different from calling them, well, for example, girl groups or girl bands or something like that, as you mentioned also in your book.
Oh, well, thanks so much for that, Lasse. Yeah, so for those of you not familiar with Japanese language, historically, these groups of all women performers, whether they were playing instruments or just singing, but usually I focus on the instrumental performers, were called Garozu Bando, which is a girls band. And typically they would be a kind of sort of thrown together by Svengali in the music world. Here, give these women instruments, let them play or have them sing, and we'll make money. And what I think is really important by choosing the phrase josei rock instead, women's rock or female rock, is that you're putting more emphasis on, first, these are grown women, they're not girls, and thus they're not being sort of like diminished or sort of, it's a way of respecting their artistic work instead of saying this is frivolous stuff. And I think rock is nice because it's a little more specific genre, even though there's, of course, lots of different subcategories in rock and roll. So I thought that was the phrase to use in this, that emphasizes the important thing to get across there. And I think that in terms of that, Yumin comes, even though she started playing at a very young age, and producing records at a very young age, she always sounds very mature. And dealing with themes that were always like a level kind of at an adult level, it seems, in her songs and her song lyrics.
I think so. I mean, she was 18 years old when she made her debut, actually 50 years ago. She's celebrating her 50th anniversary this year, which is, or there have been various kinds of quite big events in Japan. So she's still making music, as are Shonen Knife, I think, as well. So that's obviously very interesting, and I think that I may completely agree with you. She's so mature. And the 14th Moon, the album that I discussed in my book, it's actually her fourth album from 1976, but considering her whole career, it was actually only at the very, very early stages of her career, although he was a very focal figure in contemporary popular music in Japan already at that time. Kind of getting back to your conceptualization of Jose rock, because as you mentioned, it's a different term that is used in Japan. I mean, they usually use the term God is a bando or girls bands or things like that. I think that one point that connects our discussion, our books with each other is also that we are foreign scholars and white scholars dealing with Japanese music, and more specifically women in Japanese music, which can also pose issues. And it also entails some problems, I would say. How have you tackled these issues?
Yeah, I think you're totally right about that. And I think it's wise of us to be conscious of this when we write. I tried to put as much emphasis on the voice of the artist as possible in my book. So I was able to speak with Naoko and interview her and be in contact with Noriko. Very kindly put me in contact with her manager. And I spoke with some of the other groups that are connected or related to Shonen Knife in some respect, including Brooke and knife collectors. So it was, I did the best as much as I could to make sure I was trying to center those voices. And I know not all people who write 33 1/3 do this, but I also shared my book with Noriko before it went to press and asked her for any insider input or things that she would like to correct or comment on, to make sure that I was being, doing the right thing in writing this, because I am a fan and a scholar, and I didn't want to feel like I was capitalizing or dissecting the music that these people very kindly lent to me in their time. That being said, though, I think, we were chatting earlier, something interesting is that being a little bit outside of Japanese music culture, I think in a way is what's allowed us to see these connections between Shonen Knife and Yumin, that most people, at least in Japan, would not put Shonen Knife and Yumin in the same category ever, because they're such different genres with pop punk and city pop. I was wondering if you could talk, I'd like to hear a little bit about more how you approached coming to Yumin from sort of this outsider perspective in some respects. And then also, you mentioned about how Yumin's 14th Moon is kind of the beginning seeds of city pop, which is now quite popular with the young people.
Which is kind of surprising, because it's music from Japan from over 40 years ago, but now it's suddenly a trend in Europe and America. But for the first question, yes, obviously, I mean, we are not only white scholars, but in my case, I'm also a male discussing women music. So the way how I've tried to kind of go beyond or solve that issue is that, well, as you mentioned, I think that it's important that we give sufficiently voice to the people whose music we're actually discussing. And when I'm discussing the impact that Yumin possibly had on women in Japan in the 1970s, I'm basically quoting women writers from Japan at that time, and also using the theories by Japanese feminist scholars. So that's how, obviously, I mean, I do acknowledge that my positioning has some issues here, but I've tried to solve them by basically giving voice to those persons who are actually or who have been living in this time and actually encountered these issues that I discuss in my book. And well, as you said, I also think that this kind of outsider viewpoint can actually contribute something original or some new viewpoints to how these topics can be discussed, and that's obviously or from my perspective at least, that's very good kind of intercultural communication as well. And I think that actually the topic of city pop perfectly aligns with that, because we are now talking about the new trend, Japanese music becoming quite popular in the West. And well, I'm not sure if everyone here is familiar with city pop, but basically, I think that the trend that is now going on in the West is basically related to music of the 1980s, popular music and mainstream popular music of the 1980s, and a certain kind of sound that this music has. But Yuming, even though her music was not called city pop in the 1970s, it's now classified as such because of these kind of big city themes that she discusses and the kind of polished sound, which is something that is often associated with city pop. So on the 14th Moon, the album that I discussed, there's a very fitting example, a song called 2 Freeway, which is basically about riding on a freeway, probably in a convertible, at least in a car. So it's kind of, or it has been also called in Japan as a kind of Americanized version of Tokyo. So it has this kind of big city feeling. So that's one of the reasons why Yuming is considered to be a pioneer of city pop music.
You know, thinking about that and like riding the Chuo freeway, it was never a very fast freeway when I was on there, unless you were getting out of the city. But that's a great point. Something that really struck me about 14th Moon too is that I'm thinking, like, I'm sure Spotify or whatever might categorize it as city pop, but there's so many different genres that Yumin is actually working in on that album, and like really throughout her whole musical output, she's not just one musical theme.
Yeah, it's quite funny because, as I discussed in my book, she has been basically called to represent or being a pioneer in a genre called new music, which was a kind of forerunner to city pop. But she has also been characterized as folk and as city pop and as J-pop and pop and well, all kinds of things you could mention here. And actually, when I read your book, I thought that this probably concerns Shonen Knife as well. I mean, we can conceptualize it as punk rock, but then again, if we say punk here in the West, it's quite different from Shonen Knife, isn't it?
Yeah, totally. In fact, I'm so glad you brought this up, because a lot of people say, oh, or a lot of, news articles about Shonen Knife call them punk or pop punk, compare them to the Ramones. They did do a Ramone cover album, which clarifies some of that sort of comparison, as well as they were inspired by Ramones initially as well, musically. But in terms of their actual recordings, they've got all sorts of genres going on, not just pop punk, but like heavy metal, hip hop tracks. They've got funky tracks. They've got sort of, avant-garde, avant rock kind of sounding music as well. To the point that even though we might use the shorthand of punk to describe them, they're really all over the place. And like you mean, they're not boxed in by one specific genre. And I think that's something that's really important for both of these female groups in Japan, is that they're not letting labels define what kind of music or art they make. And they're always reinventing or rethinking what they want to do.
And I think that that's also an important part of their musical or artistic authorship, which is something that we also discuss in our books. And something that strikes me about Shonen Knife is not only the stylistic variety or the generic variety that they have, but also that perhaps the way they perform and the lyrics that they sing possibly do not really align with our impression of punk rock.
Yeah, that's so true. So yeah, a lot of my argument for punk rock was not so much based on their lyrics or their performance as such. Is wonderful. If you ever have a chance to see Shonen Knife live, I highly recommend it. You'll walk away feeling like $1,000,000. They're smiling the whole time on stage. They're having a blast. They're singing songs about sushi and banana chips and cats and rocket ships. Not the typical lyric, or Barbie. Twist Barbie is a great one. Not the typical things you would hear at a punk show. But I think their approach, their aesthetic approach that I call in my book the DIY or the do-it-yourself approach, is what really, I think, makes them punk in spirit, if not in what we would call the sound of punk. because they started off, they had no musical background training. They just got some guitars. Atsuko started playing drums on phone books, practiced on phone books until their first show. And so they're totally self-taught. They're not virtuosic, and virtuosity isn't the point of any of this music. And that's what I really like about them, is that like a lot of people prior, I think, to this book had sort of brushed them off as not being musically sophisticated. Their lyrics aren't musically sophisticated, so they're not worthy of study. But in fact, sophistication and virtuosity are value systems that don't necessarily fit what Shonen Knife, I think, is getting at in their music.
Yeah, actually, one thing that I was impressed about your book is the way that you kind of analyze these themes that have been considered to be frivolous or not that important or just nonsense. I mean, singing cute songs about bananas and chocolate and things like that. But actually, I think that you or the way that you explain what this actually means and what it can entail is very compelling, because it makes at least me hear Shonen Knife in an entirely new light. So could you say a few more words about that? I mean, what do you think? Why are they singing about food and what it means, perhaps?
Well, thanks so much for your kind words, Lasse. Well, for me, I noticed something. I don't know if you've all have ever heard Shonen Knife's music. You probably noticed they sing a lot about food. In fact, I have a table in here. I think it's 44 tracks over 40 years, something around that number, about food. There's at least one food song on every full-length album, and usually multiple ones. Like Happy Hour is the one with the most food songs, which is why I chose it. But for me, I think I see food as doing a lot of different things. And I got to bring a little tip my toes in food studies writing this book, which is a whole fascinating field right now. But from my perspective, I saw this discourse and this sort of lyrical focus on food, ranging from, like I said, sushi and what we call pot stickers in the US, gyoza, to banana chips, to ice cream, to candy bars, everything. I saw it as being a way of Shonen Knife, a specific, mostly you typically Naoko, the lead singer, to sing about everyday pleasure without having to turn to centering this pleasure on a man or a romantic relationship, or without having to center longing on romance, on heteronormative romance. So I see food as this really important vehicle, actually, not only for maybe expressing a gender, like taking a gendered stereotype of like women cooking food in the kitchen for families and stuff, but taking it and turning it on its head into a vehicle for actual expression of self-desire and agency. I'm not sure if I put that clearly enough, but
Yeah, you
that's what I
definitely
was trying
did.
to get at in the book.
Yeah, you definitely did. And that's one aspect I found absolutely fascinating about your discussion. I mean, it's something that I would never have thought about the lyrics, that there is this profound level that links with these much larger themes of society and the position of women as well. And well, obviously, this is something that is again something that our books share with each other.
Yeah, you talk about in your book how Yumin discusses sort of features her heroine singer narrator. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think that it actually connects with the topic that I mentioned earlier, comparing Yumin to many other female singers of this time, who are basically mostly singing lyrics written by male lyricists, which kind of put the man in the center. So there has been studies about lyrics from the 1970s sung by female singers, and statistically, in many songs, the focus is on the man. So it's basically about women devoting themselves to men, which is also a kind of strong message that send on true popular music in the media that this is how women should be like.
Mhm.
And Yumin is completely different from this, or not completely, because she does sing about romance and she does sing about men as well. But I think that, and this is something that I also discuss in my book, I think that her heroines are more centered on themselves, so to say. So they are singing about their own emotions, how they experience the world. So they are not focusing on men, but they are focusing on how they enjoy well, as you said, everyday life, individual moments, and how they enjoy the romance, not putting the emphasis or the focus on the man, but on themselves. And I
Yeah.
think that this is a very difference between, well, earlier popular songs and then the work by Yumin and other singer-songwriters or female singer-songwriters who really became a big phenomenon in Japan in the 1970s.
Yeah, I love how you talk about that, because for me, yeah, seeing sort of like female agency, female, like sort of relishing female pleasure as and putting that front and center, I think was something really important that Yumi did in her music in the 1970s. And I saw connecting to sort of a broader sort of entertainment, artistic wave happening at that time with the rise of women-led shoujo manga groups like Year 24 and being connected to that as well. And I also was thinking about how this also connected to, I think, different ways and concepts of feminism in Japan at the time too. And you mentioned we talked a little bit about in our conversations, and we touch on this in our books. That's a difficult topic. Is the topic of feminism in Japan, because the way the word feminism, the Japanese word for feminism in Japan, has a very different connotation to it than the word feminism has in the United States, and from what I understand, that's true in Finland as well.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I think that feminism in Finland is much more connected to feminism in the United States, or resembles feminism in the United States as compared with feminism in Japan in the 1970s or nowadays. But yes, I mean, I think that what is also interesting about Yumin, and I guess that you could also make this connection with Shonen Knife, that as you mentioned, there was this rise of feminist movements in the 1970s. First, quite radical feminist movements who were really subversive and rebellious and wanted to change the whole social system. And then when we come to the mid 1970s, there's this rise of liberal feminism, and basically is not as radical, but attempts to attain the same rights for women that men have in society. And something that I discuss in my book is that I kind of connect women with this development, although she has not said in her writings or interviews that she be a feminist herself, but I think that she can still be read in this liberal feminist context. She was representing this liberal feminist change in popular music, or that's what I argue in my book, at least.
Well,
Do you think,
especially since she kept working after getting married, I thought that was a really big deal at the time, being such a prominent entertainer and to continue having a career.
Yeah, I think that's obviously a very important example. Although she originally intended to actually end her career with her marriage, but we're all lucky, or we're happy that she did not. But do you think that there's such a connection also with Shonen Knife?
I do actually, and that's why, reading your writing on liberal feminism, I agree completely. I think that continued to the 1980s, partially because of the booming economy of the 1980s. Sort of, I think Ayako Kano cites the Onna no Jidai, the era of women in that time period. And this idea of a liberal feminism where women are more it's a more nuanced feminism. It's not as radical. And that's part of the problem in Japan today, is that I think the word feminism has a lot of negative connotations surrounding radicalism and like being unwomanly. Feminism means to be unwomanly, ironically, in Japanese cultural context sometimes. Whereas I think you can definitely be a feminist and still be feminine. And I think that's what Shonen Knife is doing. They're doing this, they're performing what have historically been coded a sort of male musical genre with historically coded white male musical instruments, guitars, drum set, bass. So I don't think you can say their activity is not feminist in some respects, but I think that they've never been like, we're feminists, we're here to kick male butt or anything like that. But rather, I think in their existing for 40 years is a sign of some kind of devotion to what it means to be pro women in rock and for the same sort of like equality. I also think, yeah, by singing songs about food and cute things that, you know, we might call girly or something like that, is actually a way of being like, look, you don't have to throw away your womanhood to be a kick-ass woman. I mean, you can be a kick-ass woman like Yumin and Naoko Yamano into your 60s.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And I think that I like the way how you discuss how Shonen Knife kind of transforms these concepts and presents them to listeners in an entirely new light, kind of expressing that you can be feminine and you can be cool, as you said that. And actually, one expression that I like that Yumin said, well, basically around 10 years after she had made the 14th Moon, is that she was possibly representing backstage feminism. That's also an expression I quote in my book, but I think that could be also said about Shonen Knife.
I like that phrase. And I think that really applies to a lot of sort of the contemporary generation of female artists today, that I mentioned in the sort of last chapter. And you have some sort of youth legacies as well in your chapter, but especially artists in Japan today, like Otoboke Beaver, even, I don't know, in some ways, I wonder if Baby Metal is towing the line. Baby Metal is definitely in an idol group, but they're doing things that I think are part of that sort of backstage feminist world.
Yeah, which is something that I had never thought about before, but you very skillfully show the connection. I mean, also Baby Metal, as you mentioned in your book, they sing about chocolate. And they have these very cute outfits and very cute ways of performing combined with heavy metal. So, and that's a direct connection with Shonen Knife. So I think that the artists that we discussed, they have really had a very, very significant impact on popular music of today.
Yeah. Well, should we wrap this up here and open the floor to questions, perhaps?
Yeah, that sounds very good.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Lasse, and thank you so much for listening.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for listening to us. And thank you, Brooke, for the discussion.
Much to both of you. That was a really wonderful conversation. And it was a real conversation. It was so much fun to see the back and forth, and your deep knowledge of each other's work. So we have some questions, starting off with Carl.
Yeah. I thought that was a great discussion. Thank you. I've been familiar with Shonen Knife for a very long time. It feels like, because they got a lot of coverage in the like indie rock press of the 80s and 90s in America. And there are sort of twofold questions coming out of that. One is maybe the question of how they emerged and how that was managed on their side. And then on the reception side, I felt at the time, and particularly in retrospect, that a lot of the coverage tended to use that kind of food and cute subject matter, and sort of their stage costumes and all of these things tended to come across a little bit fetishized and a little bit exoticized in ways that were that rhymed with kind of a lot of the Western attitudes to Japan at the time. And I'd love to hear you talk about that.
Thanks so much, Carl. Yeah, I agree completely with the way they were portrayed by Western critics, especially in the 80s and 90s. Part of that, I think, Naoko was certainly aware of. And I think she was aware of it and utilized it to her advantage in many respects. And sort of played with these. She's like they all know what the stereotypes are. They're not dumb by any means. So it's like they were playing with these stereotypes. The rock critics were in on the joke or not was a different matter. But I've even seen reviewers who write their language in an accented manner that just like appalling, actually. Is unbelievable. But at the same time, Shonen Knife, was getting a lot of coverage in the 80s and early 90s because they did have these things going for them in terms of cute. It's like an effervescent juxtaposition of cuteness with punk rock, perfect for postmodern audiences. And they were playing, their big break came when they opened for Nirvana, and Kurt Cobain was a huge fan. And they opened for Nirvana right before Nevermind came out. I think it was in the bleached era. And they were also, Thurston Moore is a big fan, and Thurston Moore actually appears on one of their tracks on Concrete Animals. So they had these connections to these pretty big names and big groups that gave them a kind of name recognition, I think, in our generation that is actually not true of their popularity in Japan. And correct me if you feel differently, Lasse or Noriko, but I get the sense that Shonen Knife are more well known in the United States than they are in Japan. Aside from Osaka rock circles, Tokyo rock circles know who Shonen Knife is, but it's really interesting how globally, internationally they're known.
Okay,
Thank you.
Eric, you have a question for both presenters
Yes.
about the album.
Thank you. And Noriko, if you're interested, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as well. Since we are partially today talking about the Japan 33 1/3 series, I thought I would ask a fairly broad question about the category of the album in Japan and whether the kinds of landmarks we associate with Anglo-US tradition, like show tunes and adult pop in the 1950s turning into counterculture in the late 60s, or MTV era repositories of music videos in the 1980s, if that's similar in Japan or takes different shapes. Is the album in Japan in some ways similar to how it's in the United States and England, a sort of place to position yourself as not fully pop and having some connection to a larger notion of artistry? Or are there completely other ways in which the album functions in Japan? So any thoughts you have about that, I think would be wonderful to hear as we're sort of contemplating this other version of the 33 1/3 series.
Yeah, so if I may just jump in for a second. My observation about albums in Japan is, yes, there is that phenomenon of being an artist with a concept, developing a particular album. And I would also say that there are really two types of albums released by J-pop artists, which are typically a collection of singles. And then there are, albums that are meant to make a statement by many other types of artists. And I had a very interesting discussion with people in the music industry around 2006 when ringtones were a major way that record companies were making money. And what I found to be interesting about these ringtones is oftentimes people were not buying the entire song, they were just buying the chorus. So I asked a hypothetical question. Well, if that's all they're going to buy, then why don't you just manufacture a bunch of choruses? And they looked at me in horror, of course, and they said, well, our artists, in order to be artists, they had to write a, entire 3 to 5 minute song. And I said, well, what, if it's iTunes, why would anybody buy an entire album? Why don't you just do a bunch of singles? And they said, oh, but our artists have to express themselves as artists. And they also said that, CD sales took a long time to wind down in Japan. So album sales were actually continuing to be meaningful for a much longer time than they did over the past 2 days. So they've had much more commercial traction, I would say. That having been said, in dealing with this particular 3 1/3 Japan series, I was actually encouraged by the editors at Bloomberg to take a very liberal conceptual approach to the idea of the album. And so I've defined the album as a small collection of work. And so an anime isn't necessarily an album. There's often a soundtrack that comes with it. But what really makes it a collection of work is the anime, not necessarily the CD. So we thought of it that way. AKB48, the authors in question refused to do it on a particular album because they said the album doesn't matter for AKB48. What matters is that you come to the meet and greet because that's how this particular thing works. So anyway, so that would be my 2 cents. So I should turn it back over to Lasse and Brooke.
Well, I think that as Noriko said, something that is very important here is that the concept of the album and the significance of the album really depends on the type of the artist. I mean, and also it depends on the time period. So for example, for artists or singer-songwriters like Yuming or certain rock bands, for example, it's very important to have this concept of a concept album, a kind of artistic statement about something. Whereas for other types of artists, if we're now talking about the 1970s, the early idol singers, for example, well, albums were basically commodities that you could release 3 times a year and to make as much money as you could for the time that you can. So it really depends on the type of artists, I would say.
Did you want to say anything, Brooke?
I don't think I have much to add to that other than, to back up with Noriko, the album or like record sales, CD sales are still surprisingly strong in Japan. They still have Tower Records, which is a pleasure to visit if you ever make it over there. And yeah, I think it's a concept that's still existing in Japan more so, I sense, than the United States, but who knows?
Yeah, and the other thing I would say is that because the record industry is still revolving around albums, there tends to be a concerted effort to kind of keep it going because albums are going to be more profitable than single tracks.
And just to mention, Brooke mentioned Tower Records, and in case you're not familiar with Tower Records, the main store in Shibuya in Tokyo has 8 floors of physical records.
Oh man, it sounds like paradise.
It's a mecca.
Our next questions come.
Hi. So forgive me, I have a bit of hoarseness, remnants from the cold. So Brooke, I wanted to ask you about a couple of things that you mentioned about your process, which I thought was really interesting. I just finished a 33 1/3 book myself, and there's some resonances there and some of the things you're talking about. So being a fan and a scholar, and then working on this book, I'm wondering if you could talk about maybe some of the, I don't know, complications or challenges of both wanting to be as, how do I put this? I don't want to say objective because that's not the word I want, but wanting to have distance, but also wanting to honor the band and the work. And at the same time, you talked about showing the band the work ahead of time. And so I wonder if you could just, and this is just a broad question, if you could talk a little bit about the complications and challenges, and then maybe also boundaries. And maybe you didn't have any of those issues, but I'm just wondering if you could talk about how you handled boundaries in terms of showing the band the work at the end and all of that. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kim. I can't wait to read your book. I'm going to keep an eye out for it. I had, yeah, it was a little bit nerve-wracking times, especially, I think for me, the most difficult song I wrote about in this book, though I didn't say much about it, was actually gyoza, which is about Chinese pot stickers, because Shonen Knife uses a lot of Orientalist tropes in the song that we would recognize from sort of the same Orientalist tropes that composers in the classical world drew on for hundreds of years, in terms of shimmering bells and pentatonic scales and a gong. And I was like, what do I say about this? Like, how do I wrap my mind around this? And what they're singing about is a Chinese dish that comes to Japan and then becomes part of Japanese cuisine. And there's so much caught up in that song that it was scary. And I tried to take a rigorous approach to analyzing that song and thinking about that song, but also being mindful that this was a song that Noriko wrote and that was going to be read by her. So thinking about like what I think that song was doing was playing with those Orientalist tropes. Is a way that you can also say, I don't know if the upcoming book on Yellow Magic Orchestra maybe talks about Orientalism and how sort of the appropriation of self-Orientalism to different ends. So I think that's what was going on in the track, but I don't know if everyone would agree with me on that. But that was the scariest thing I had to write about in terms of like, what do I say about this? But yeah, but it was also a real gift to be able to now go about this music. And she's looking back, there are things that she's, oh, wow, I didn't think about it, but that is what I was doing there. That was really cool to experience.
Thank you.
Thank you. Krisha, you have a question.
Yeah. Hey. This was so cool. I just have to say, this was so cool. This was great. There's like a million layers here. I have way too much I want to say, and then way too much I want to ask. So it's got to, like, it's important. Okay, so the first is, one of the things that's so exciting to me is how, as a culture, many cultures, we're all trying to, like humans, trying to figure out like how to deal with each other. I'm really thinking about that as I'm listening to the two of you, because just at the risk of sounding like way out, there's a white girl from Kentucky growing up in the 70s, everywhere else seems so far away. And I'm just kind of shaken. It's so important to me to hear all our different accents and just to see all our different skin colors. And I hope as we evolve, we just, I don't know, do the right thing. I just hope in a liberal left way. Like, I just hope that that's what happens. Okay, so my question, other than thank you, is, which is a statement. So can fandom be as feminist as like learning your own instruments and getting on a stage? Because one of my first introductions to Japan was Cheap Trick in the 70s, had their album, which was like live in another country. And I was like, who are all these fans? Who are these people? Wow, I want to be at that concert. So can fandom be as feminist? Is my question.
You want to take this, Lasse?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you very much for those very, very nice words, and just thank you. That was very inspiring for us as well. And as for your question, well, that's a very, very fascinating question. And it's also a very complex question, I would say. And well, how I discuss it in my book is that I would argue that yes, femdom can be feminist, and kind of referring to Small's theory of musicking, or thinking about music as an activity or an act. I think that being a fan and listening to music and supporting a certain kind of music, that is also a statement. You possibly do not consciously think of it as such, but that can be conceptualized as a statement. And in this case, if you, for example, are or belong to the fandom of these women who are expressing their authorship and authenticity and kind of making their own music and making their own statements, obviously you are also support all that. So I would argue that is a kind of feminist statement at the same time. That's how I see it.
Yeah, I agree completely. And thank you so much, Lucretia.
Okay, and we have a question from Francesca.
Hi, I am enjoying this so much. My question is really just about writing and translation, and the extent to which translation is kind of a meta issue or kind of problematic as you're, or not problematic because that casts a negative light, but just like in theoretically and otherwise that you're engaging in the book. And I wasn't sure, not having had a chance yet to take a look at the 33 and a half Japan series, to what extent it's Western thing, or would you describe it that way? Just curious about that. Thanks.
I'll step in here first, but I think this is a really cool side topic that we didn't get to touch. So I'm glad you asked this question, Francesca. From my perspective, and Noriko, correct me if I'm wrong, I feel like the Japan 33 and its third series is Western facing, or English reader facing, basically. But I gave several of my Japanese friends the book as well, because most people in Japan grow up learning English from a very young age. So for me, this was an opportunity to write an intellectually stimulating book about a band that maybe most people interested in rock music had never heard of before. But something I think in terms of translation, especially in terms of song lyrics, it's really interesting that both Lasse and I have connections in terms of both Shonen Knife and Yumin use English words frequently in their songs. And once Shonen Knife started becoming bigger and bigger abroad, they started writing almost exclusively in the English language, actually. So basically, their albums from around the post-Happy Era are almost exclusively in English. Originally, they would release only in Japanese, and then they switched to having Japanese language tracks and English language tracks. So it's kind of a cool phenomenon in terms of the role English language plays in both of these artists' trajectories.
Yeah, thank you indeed, Francesca, for the very, very important question. And I think that actually you can see this in both of our books, that they are indeed Western facing. And that's also why I think that they contain a lot of contextualization that we would not need if we were writing for a Japanese language audience, for example. And well, I think that it's also important that Brooke mentioned that this is basically for an English language audience, because well, I'm a non-native speaker, so I noticed that also the way that I would write to a Finnish audience, which is my native country, Finland, would be slightly different from writing to this kind of what we perceive as an international audience, but is actually I came to that it's more specific. It's actually an English language audience. So I definitely think that's different.
Okay.
Thank you.
Catherine, did you want to?
Oh, I don't know. I just keep coming back the songs about bananas, and I'm really, I mean, I thought it was just going to be kind of like a tourist here in this discussion, because I was thinking I know nothing about Japanese music. Like I really didn't think I did, aside from, you know, a couple of bands. But then this, you know, songs about bananas kept coming up, and I started thinking about this video game, Katamari Damacy. I don't know whether either of you know this game. It is perhaps one of my favorite video games of all time. There is even and a lot of it involves like rolling up bits of food. And there's even like a level where you're rolling up bananas, and as you're rolling up bananas, there's this there's a voiceover that goes ba na na as you're rolling up these bananas. And I think anyway, I'm just kind of trying to say, like, I'm here and I'm thinking about these things. I don't really know that I have a question. I think maybe I was starting to figure out a question when we were talking about like what the idea of an album is, because in that game, the soundtrack, I mean, it's really great. It's a really great pop soundtrack. And you know, I've looked it up and I've seen that like people compile it. And so I guess that's sort of, it's an interesting way to enter Japanese pop. I guess for me, and so I don't know. That's, anyway, I'm here, I'm listening. I like cute songs about bananas, and I don't really know how to frame this as a question. That's all I've got. Sorry.
No, thank you so much, Catherine, because someone had mentioned this game to me and I had forgotten about it. So I'm so glad you put it back on my radar, because I'm working on video game music and gender now too. And in Japan. So this is a perfect next project for me to look at. And if you like cute songs about banana chips, you must, or bananas, you must listen to Banana Chips.
Okay, actually, I would like to hear more about that. Like, what are video games and gender music?
Yeah, so I have an article coming out in an Oxford edited volume on video game music about some of the similar issues Lasse and I have been talking about in terms of gender and dynamics at play. I'm working on 1980s video game music composers that were based in the Osaka area, and what it meant to be a women video game music composer at that time, and how they were very, very influential early on in the industry, but sort of women started departing the main companies around early 1990s for other career trajectories that were like in many ways not as brutal and as patriarchal as the corporate world.
It's hard for me to imagine, any place that, I understand. I understand the departure. Oh, it's really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
So if I can ask one more question. I realize all of my fellow organizers have now asked questions, so I can't have to ask. I don't know, actually I've been thinking about this for since the middle of the conversation, but I'm just curious to hear you two talk about how aging affected your artists and their reception, and you know how it may have transformed or not transformed their work, but just how they approach that, you know, inevitable issue, you know, which can be maybe a particularly challenging issue for women in a patriarchal world.
Yeah, that's definitely a very, very important question. Perhaps I can start because I'm talking about her music in my book. And well, I think that Yuming, for her, I mean, she has been able to kind of renew her image from one decade to another. So but obviously there are challenges as well. I mean, I think that Yuming, because she has been operating in the music world for 50 years, so she has this double role as an active musician, but then again, she's also a classic already. She's something from the past toward which, or toward whose music people feel nostalgia, for example. So I think that's a kind of interesting hybrid aspect of her image. And that's also something which I think that has perhaps paradoxically helped her or retain her status as a prominent artist. I mean, she has this long background, but then again, she's always making something new. So I think that's one of her kind of answers to this issue. I'm not sure if I'm making any sense here.
Yeah, it's so interesting because I see Shonen Knife in a similar trajectory as always, renewing, like trying different styles. Naoko is been the steady rock throughout the 40 years. I guess it's now 41. Oh my gosh. And then her sister Atsuko typically started out on bass and typically comes back and plays drums, or not drums. Will also come. She used to play drums. Now she plays bass, and she'll play bass in the current sort of recording studios and usually in live shows as well in Japan. But their drummers had a rotation of drummers since Happy Hour was released. The original bassist left, so they had a lot of rotating members, and the constant has always been renewal and Naoko. Then that everything stays the same and everything changes, I guess. And that's, I think, how you stay young. You keep playing music, keep rocking, and keep trying new things. And that's why they're still touring today.
So much. This has been a wonderful session. Again, really, really loved watching you two talk to each other and everything that came out of it. So thanks so much. We have our next session coming up on October 25th, Ricky Rodriguez with Alex Vasquez. That should be a wonderful session as well. So I hope many of you will come to that. And let's thank our presenters.